Sheila said, I'm a Lander resident and I love my community, love the people that are here, and want to grapple with this question of what do we do about the situation that we find ourselves in, that land prices are high, housing prices are high, tensions are high, and the needs that many people are experiencing continue to increase as days go by. And so in this context, what I am going to offer to you is a description of how we escape the housing trap. So we'll talk about what this housing trap is and go through it. And towards the end, I've set aside 6 discussion questions specifically related to the Tsawwassen Town Center proposal, as well as the relationship that it has with the broader work of establishing strong communities that are going to prosper. Tomorrow, there's more. We're going to talk about the financial performance of communities, which has already put half the audience to sleep, but actually is very important, and not just important, but actually interesting and exciting in its own way. And so some of what I reference in terms of the general prosperity building capacity of our communities will be demonstrated much more fully tomorrow. So look forward to that. Definitely come back for tomorrow's session from 10 till noon. But right now, what we want to do is go through this question of how do we escape the housing trap. My printer wasn't working this morning, as I should not have left it to last minute, but my printer wasn't working this morning. So there is a QR code that'll pop up at the end as well. If you're interested in more resources related to this topic, want to do further study in this, if there's things that I've said that have either provoked you or caused you to say, that's interesting and I want to hear more about it, please do let me know. The other thing is, I have a tendency to speak really rapidly. And so if at any point you say, look, young man, just slow down, go ahead and say that. I had an elderly congregant, she came up to me after a sermon and she said, Pastor, I think you enjoyed preaching, but I have no idea what you just said. And I think that we can sometimes all find ourselves in that situation, but specifically as I get fired up about this topic, as someone that lives here in the community, that just in October had to find a new place to rent and had to find a place that I could afford with a very limited, or with the budget that we had, and grappling with the fact that within 3 hours of the house that we did get, we're in the upstairs unit, by the time that 3 hours had passed, 14 people had already reached out to the landlord. And the landlord just said, I just want people that are normal. So you guys seem normal enough, we'll take you. But this is something of the urgency or the need that we face in our communities. But if we talk about, in the description of the topic, and you see the reference there to Strong Towns, what is Strong Towns and what are we about? We're a nonprofit member-supported organization that is grappling with this reality. And I'll say it's a reality, and especially tomorrow will really underscore this. That the prevailing pattern of development is making North American cities and towns weak and fragile. And so in just 5 words, our nonprofit organization, which has 6,000 members around the world, but also millions of people that are reading our stuff, identifying as Strong Towns, wearing the Strong Towns t-shirts, kind of picking up this new way of framing many of the common challenges that we face, are saying we seek to change that. And I think deep down, we all have a desire to manage change, to approach change, and make it something that we can work with. But what Strong Towns has led the way in identifying is that there's this prevailing pattern that we need to correct for, or else many of the superficial surface things won't actually be resolved. There is also a very important reality that we face, that there is no silver bullet solution to this. This is a continent-wide problem. And we'll talk about the continent-wide experiment in building out in a suburban style of development, and the way in which this experiment has not gone well. And the way in which we have experienced for a season the fruits of that experiment in a positive way, but are increasingly beginning to see its negatives as well. And so what can be done to provide housing to people in places where that housing has become scarce, expensive, and hotly contested? And I want to draw on a local example here of an article that I wrote about a member of our community here in Tsawwassen. She asked me to use a pseudonym because the arrangement that she came up to with her niece was to sell 50% of her property to her niece, and then her niece moved into the main house, and because of the most curious loophole that I still don't think has been met, she was allowed to build an amazing backyard cottage that totally suited her. The way that she was allowed to do this is because technically this building is attached to the main building. By means of a mistake that the concrete contractor had done back in the 60s or the 70s when the initial main house was built. They had extended out the foundation, realized they didn't need to build on that, but Sarah Gallup, one of our local designers, said, technically, we can get around this and you can build your secondary structure here that is designed for aging in place, perfectly suitable for her needs, allowing her niece to move into the main home and her to be able to live in her home, in her space, never having to go much further than she ever used to meet her neighbors, to interact with the things that she loves in the community. And it's in this context that we also are grappling with this challenge, that the very thing that made what she did was having to sort her way through a very, very minute loophole tied into what we're facing here in our community as we grapple over growth in our community and the ways in which we accommodate that growth, the ways in which we recognize that these are desirable places to live, people yearn to live here, and at the same time, many are prevented from doing so because of high costs, who may be discouraged from ever doing so, or are going to find alternate ways of still finding ways to live here. And this is one of the questions that we can ask. What are those alternatives? What are the ways that we can provide for that housing? For a longer look at this question and where the title of the presentation came from is a book that my colleague Chuck Marone, as well as my former colleague Daniel Harrigus, have written called Escaping the Housing Trap, the Strongtown's response to the housing crisis. It's a good read, it's 150 pages, I think. Would definitely recommend it, but don't feel obliged to rush off to go do that just yet. Because we're going to go through its core elements. At its core, one of the challenges that we face is that we need to allow the next increment of development to be allowed in every neighborhood in America, and Canada as well. I always say broadly, actually contentiously right now, we should be very specific. America and the Bay of America, or a Gulf of America discussion. This should say North America. I'll update my slide tonight. On that front though, what do I mean by the next increment of development? When a neighborhood is constructed, typically it's constructed with single detached houses. Over time, people build pool houses, they build garden sheds, they build other structures. But the thing that defines our modern approach to city planning is that the moment that you propose to put grandmother into one of those structures, you're forbidden from doing so. And this is very different from what Chuck Marone, my colleague, began to observe as he looked at the pattern of development that really marked traditional development. Cities and towns across millennia were marked by the gradual evolution of neighborhoods, such to the point that there would be no room for this type of prescriptive specifying on a dot-by-dot basis where each of these different types of housing could exist. And oh wait, there's more. In this context, all of these things that we would say would be places for people to live are so outlined, and also up until just recently with a significant change prompted by provincial legislation to the official community plans, which still hasn't caught up in our bylaws, but we're working towards that point. In that context, one of the things that's clear is that we, for a long time, said, we're going to put this principle of renewal on the shelf. This principle of local response to local need in a timely fashion is going to be put on the shelf because we prefer this. It's orderly, it's structured, we know exactly what is going to be on the lot, not just today, but also 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now. Almost to the point where it highlighted for me what I saw in White Rock, for example, where you see realtors selling properties with 360-degree views. That's a check you can't cash. You don't have responsibility for the property next door. And so if there's a development that occurs there, or there's change that occurs there, your 360 becomes 270, becomes 180. And in that context, the answer to the question of how do we allow this type of change to occur is not to say, let's lock it down and restrict the capacity of our places to evolve. We talk about these yellow zoned areas, places of what up until just recently were exclusively for single detached residences as the Great Wall or the Great Yellow Wall. In that context, what happens is you see entire neighborhoods that are built out to a finished state and then left as they are, with really fierce opposition, even to simple things like taking down one home and building two homes. Or as we see much more commonly, the only thing being allowed in any of these zones is knocking down the smaller home that was on there and building a lot to the max of its capacity for single occupants, often smaller household sizes than previously were in that space. And so we have constructed, as I would say here, that a current path that was meant as a means of securing prosperity for all has actually unwittingly trapped us in a system that is incapable of building lasting prosperity. We're going to touch on some of the implications. How do we address this? But at its core, what we would propose is that local and iterative actions are the best approach to gradually create and sustain local prosperity, which will really emerge in tomorrow's discussion of how to generate and store up local wealth for the purpose of building a stronger community. But in this context, as it relates to housing, I want to say that our core principle is that no neighborhood should be subject to radical change, and that no neighborhood should be exempt from change. And it's in this context that we see neither of these principles being upheld in many of our communities. Well, we see this sudden rush to say this area is now open for redevelopment, and you walk in 10 years later and you don't recognize the place that you were previously in. But we also see many other areas where the thing that my friend had to do in order to be able to live on her own property in an age-in-place unit required this absurd loophole that resulted from the mistake that a contractor had made years before. I actually didn't even mention, if I go back to here, one of the things, it'll come up later in our zoning bylaw, is the fact that we have a specific zone for the type of housing type that she was looking for, a coach house or a backyard cottage. But we said that's only in Ladner. That doesn't apply in Tsawwassen. We don't allow those things up until just recently to be even part of the shift that we are seeing. But I want to pick up on an element of the trap that we find ourselves in. And this is the idea that we've unwittingly locked ourselves into a system that will be very difficult to emerge from. And we can use by contrast or by comparison the idea of an agriculture trap. If you are interested in agriculture and sort of its development over millennia, Yuval Noah Harari has a great sort of description of this. But the agriculture trap is predicated on the idea that first we were hunter-gatherers. Our ancient ancestors, you go back, you study their practices, they would follow the food, they would scavenge, or not scavenge, they would collect various natural resources as they went along, but largely they moved to where the access to food was most significant. And that meant following significant herds of bison and other things like this. And in this context, one of the things that you had is that you could feed a limited population. You would also see that life rates, that the years that you would live was fairly low. It's pretty difficult work to track down a woolly mammoth. It's hard work to follow the bison. Doing the work of hunting and engaging in those things is difficult on old bones before your hip replacement. And in that context, one of the things that was recognized is that this can sustain a population, but it won't be a substantial population. But over time, imagine Jim discovered that if he came to the same blueberry bush, but really worked to cultivate that bush, the next time that he came back, there was more fruit there. And fairly soon what happened, or fairly soon, I speak in terms of several centuries here, there was a shift towards agriculture. The opening up of agriculture gave a new form of civilization to many of our communities in our ancestral past. They were able to stay in place. Aside from the coast peoples here who had a source of food that would routinely just come to them and they could put nets in the river to capture it, which is why we see a different form of civilization pattern on the West Coast tribes and a great deal of opulence and wealth in these communities. In this context, the agricultural shift really allowed for the provisions for more population. And so you could sustain a larger population, you could even specialize into different types of agriculture, into crop raising and animal raising. And in this context, as your population grew, your obligation to provide enough food for that population also began to grow. And as you began to provide even more food and had more bumper crops and things like this, you could sustain an even larger population. But the trap then is that if you were to say, we've had many years of successive failures of our crops, we're really struggling with it, let's just go back to being a hunter-gatherer society. The consequence would be, in the setting, that you would need a significant culling of your population to return to the level of population that you can support in this practice. You would have a serious shift in life expectancy. You would have a serious shift in what people could expect. And so once you committed to this path, it would have been extremely difficult for each of these societies to say, we're going back. And housing is much the same way. That by trading complexity and adaptability in our neighborhoods, in our communities, we traded those things in for growth and predictability. We said we found a new way to build great communities. We're going to build them all at once and to a finished state. We're going to expand rapidly horizontally without any of the messy work of building our communities more, thickening them up by building horizontally or vertically as well. With policy, zoning regulations that were copied and pasted. Deltas came from another book of regulations that were just copied and pasted over from other places, to the point where the county, Greenlee County in Arizona, which you probably haven't heard of because very few people have heard of it, it's a tiny little place, has regulations in their code for what to do with 20-story towers and how much parking they require. That is a copy and paste mentality that was the decision of policymakers to say, let's adopt a brand new method that is, it'll allow us to grow, it'll allow us to have predictable outcomes. We're going to give up on complexity and adaptability, but we will dramatically simplify on the method of building out our cities. In the Strong Towns, we call this the suburban experiment. We traded a pattern of building communities that was complex for one that is merely complicated. Way to illustrate this is to compare a rainforest and a cornfield. A rainforest is a complex ecosystem. It has many different types of inputs, many different types of emerging sort of systems within it. We've learned that the trees can talk to each other, that the mushrooms are all working in cahoots, that all of the different creatures have vital roles to play. But imagine an American cornfield in Iowa, where there are no creatures anymore, where all of the rows are perfectly aligned, where the crop is a single species, and where all of the inputs are measured down to the truckload as to what goes in and the truckloads that go out. And in that context, you can see that farming a cornfield is a complicated process. It takes a lot of capacity. I grew up on a farm. I know how hard it is to grow crops. But it's not the same thing as a complex process. You are so close to failure with your cornfield if you get your inputs wrong, if you allow the wrong species to come in. Whereas in a rainforest, you're so much more adaptable, you have so much more capacity, even if the return from the rainforest is slightly diminished. So we said, let's take the model that juices our economy, that provides for greater capacity. It will be complicated, but we're gonna have systems in place to predictably grow our communities in this new way. We've lost sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity in this context. And we can look at this as we talk about the traditional development pattern at Strong Towns. We describe this as a pattern of really adapting from and learning from our ancestors as to how they built communities. So this is the 1870s. This is Grand Rapids, Michigan. I have some Delta slides in here as well. But my son wanted to play street hockey last night, and I was like, street hockey? Or putting in Delta specific slides, it's like, all right, I think I'll understand if you all are willing to put up with a little bit of Grand Rapids, Michigan. But why Michigan? Well, notice, for example, we could look at our Delta maps and we would see, or images in Lander Village, we would see much the same. There's complexity. There's a whole bunch of different buildings. It's kind of messy. That's okay. That's actually a key feature of what it takes to build thriving communities. You can see that over time, as people develop the means to do so, they would move from small little buildings that maybe didn't occupy the full lot to then using more of that space as their proximity to the street, as their proximity to other types of uses became commonplace. You would see this incremental growth and adaptation. Here, I mean, this is not a city planner's idea of what a really good addition looks like, and yet that was for Uncle Joe. If Uncle Joe needed a new place to live and he wasn't that pleasant to be around, you put him in that rather than having him in your home. And in this context, that was this gradual capacity that we had instilled in our cities, this thriving heartbeat of our places, adapting and growing and changing. Whereas I would premise that you can walk many of the streets of Tsawwassen and Ladner, they actually haven't changed that much, especially if you carve out the like-for-like replacement of single-family homes replaced with large single-family homes. And this is one of the challenges, actually, and I know I'm previewing a little bit of what I'm getting to. One of the challenges that we face is much of what we experience as construction activity in our cities is construction that is not actively improving our housing capacity shortage. And so we have gotten into this situation because of that whole catalog of zoning types that we said, that it is far easier and causes far less brain damage to take this shed and simply knock it down and put up the exact same thing for the same number of people than to do anything that would allow Uncle Joe to move in. And this is part of the challenge that we've gotten ourselves into. But there was another challenge that sort of got overlaid. This would be the equivalent of a famine for an agricultural society, and it was the Great Depression. Finances suddenly became extremely scarce. This hit Canada, this hit the United States. The United States responded 10 years earlier than Canada did to really address the things that were keeping people from owning their own homes. In that context, one of the things that they did is they brought in the Homeowners Loan Act of 1933. I was researching this more. Canadian governments, more at the provincial and local level, were providing cash subsidies, were providing work programs. But one of the things that the Americans recognized is that they needed to backstop the residential home market, or else it would continue to flatten. That is, if Irene over here was unable to make the payments to the bank that were owed to the bank, that Irene's house would go up for auction by the bank. But if that continued to happen, each of the buyers who actually had a little bit of cash at their disposal would simply say, well, I don't want to buy Irene's today if I can get Patty's tomorrow for significantly less. And by sitting on that capital, you see this capital depression. People are unwilling to spend it, and as a result, you get into the situation where the floor just drops out. This was happening on farms, this was happening with homes, and in response, what the federal government in the US did, Canada mimicked this in 1946, is they said, we will backstop those mortgages. So if this homeowner is not able to make their payments, we will step in and help them. And they did qualify that. They said we won't we won't backstop the mortgages of people in economically depressed areas, which typically tended to be low class or immigrant communities. But in this context, they said, we're going to step in and we're going to save and backstop our system. And one of the things that did is it did stabilize the system. So in response to a Great Depression, they set housing as a key part of this. And they backstopped it with the Federal Homeowners Act. Then, when World War II was happening, when World War II is interesting because a lot of sort of general popular theory is that it was the thing that brought the United States and the Western world out of depression, was the ability to suddenly pour a lot of resources and employ a lot of people in the work of bombing and destroying other people. In this context, and obviously there was an important necessity to take steps to take war, but there was an economic capacity or power that emerged from this action. Well, one of the things that emerged was that the White House economists recognized that if the war is to end suddenly, there will be this massive period of unemployment and industrial dislocation. Every weapons factory, every airplane factory being shut down, every paycheck that was going out to soldiers in the field now no longer going out. Not all of these men coming back and women that had been in the front lines now returning. And in that context, the fear was we're just going to go right back into the same conditions, high unemployment, low access to capital, that had given rise to the Great Depression. In this context, the federal government in the United States said we need to act. And Canada acted right in the same time too. The Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, was founded. They provided insurance. They began to really fund the construction of new neighborhoods, incentivizing the development of entirely new neighborhoods built out in suburban style, much like much of Delta, post-war, suddenly goes from sleepy sort of fishing village and a few sort of spotted cottages and cabins and things like this. All of a sudden we begin to see this rapid expansion into new neighborhoods. The home I was living in was built in the 1960s, right in this whole period of time. And the result was the federal government, not only in Canada but also in the United States, had made it easier for more people to borrow more money to pay more for housing. And this is where that trap gets set, and it can't be undone. Is that it is then impossible, or seemingly impossible, to really bring down prices significantly if you have made it so much easier for more people, that is more buyers, to be in that same market with more money in their pocket to pay more for the thing that they need. Not just want, but need. This is where one of the critiques that we have of things like a First-Time Home Buyers Act, or a First Home Buyers Credit, First-Time Home Buyers Credit and other tools like this that really seek to subsidize certain people to be in the market, is just a transfer of those funds directly into the hands of the person that said, I would have sold it to you for less, but now that you're coming to me with more, I'll take that money. You were inflating the cost of that housing by making it easier for even more people to borrow more money to pay more for housing. How did that happen? There were three sort of key components of this. Increasing the lending term. So this is where we see, and I think before long, we're going to get to 50-year mortgages, which is essentially just saying for the bulk of my lifetime, I'm renting from the bank instead of renting from another landlord. But by increasing the lending term, you also made more people able to step up and access mortgage tools, but also increase their own level of indebtedness to get into the homes. They also opened up vast amounts of land that previously were undevelopable or wouldn't have made for great development areas. Think of floodplains, think of up the hills into the mountains, many of these different sites. But the assurance was made, we will provide the services for this. And crucially, we will deter alternatives. It's right in this same period, these couple of decades after the Second World War, that you begin to see the rise of the first zoning regulations, not just of industrial slaughterhouses, but also types of housing. For example, in Vancouver, laundries were regulated to only be in specific areas. Why? This is a whole other element of it. Not because people stopped needing to be clean, but because they were owned by Chinese people. And as a result, there was, hey, we have new tools. We can specify where specific types of activities are, and very explicitly, as you look at the British properties with the land covenants that were exclusively devoted to peoples of certain nationalities and excluding many others, these legacies continue to loom, but it was all part of this practice of deterring alternatives. So you would get now the introduction of new apartments was limited to very specific zones within cities, very specific areas, and the remainder was reserved for a single type of housing, single detached homes. And the other key part of it was that highway spending, this is especially so in the States, became unlinked from local budgets. Previously, many of the decisions that were made to expand rail service, to expand that cart path to turn it into a more proper path, or to pave it with brick, or to put up boardwalks, or all of that was kept up at local expense. But in the quest to have national highway systems and national sort of connections, one of the things that happened is that many of these highway spending decisions were nationalized without sort of that local input. And the consequence of this is that many cities said, the highway is our great path for more people to live in further flung neighborhoods. Even look at the development in our region when the tunnel was brought in as opposed to having to cross by ferry. And the significant sort of land rush on this side of the river, I'm glad for it in one respect because I get to live here in a fuller community. But on the other hand, one of those elements was that it just unleashed all of this activity. It brought more people into these spaces. And so we see this very typically, this is Leviton, New York, but we have many of these places where, in contrast to that image of like the complex city in Grand Rapids or the image of an Italian villa sort of city on a hill, this was a model of development that was easy to reproduce. Skills were less required. You could run and pop up these houses. Think of Joni Mitchell, little boxes made of ticky-tack. You could build those out at speed, sort of almost like the assembly lines that had built bombs and tankers and airplanes and all of those different types of tools and systems in the world wars. And so in this context, what this proved to be was an exceptional growth machine. It was an exceptional growth machine with a path to wanting to build prosperity for many people. And many people prospered as a consequence of this. These were areas where many of these homes would either be put up or the lots would be sold off and individual owners would move in. They would be able to build their own homes, construct their way to a bit more security for themselves. But in this context, what emerged was a strong sense of having an ownership society. You owned because you didn't want to rent, rather than what was previously the case, that some owned, but many were engaged in the work of living in cities, living in smaller communities. Even you would be renting within your own town as you worked your way into the ideal life that many still, even in our context, say, like, to us, it is that ideal life for me. It's maybe a little bit more developed than this, but these were its origins, and over time we've just filled in some of the gaps. But largely, this is the type of neighborhood I want to live in. This is the type of thing I prefer. Now, what was interesting is that in the United States, we see this expansion of the suburbs even more aggressively because of the way that the federal agencies worked on this. There was a little bit more of an emphasis on urban planning up in Canada. As a result, we had a little bit more control over things like infrastructure. We were down in Florida working with a city there, and the city staff were saying, we have new developments that are being put right at the outskirts of the city. And we have a legislated obligation to provide them with the exact level of service that we do to our inner neighborhoods. And they said, we can't afford to do this. Or in Medicine Hat, Alberta, where they've been building out neighborhoods further and further away from their city center. And they said, we have neighborhoods where we pay $60,000 to $70,000 per lot to be able to provide them with the services that they need because of the extra pump capacity, because of the added obligations for sewer coverage, even just the extra miles that our garbage trucks are driving in order to be able to bring access there. Another key part of this was less freeway sprawl. Freeways were often sort of used to hopscotch your way to more, you drive till you qualify is the way that we currently talk about it. But it used to be, you drive until you don't want to drive much further, and that's where you plunk your home. With the assumption of the commuting society, you're always still going back into the city. Think of all the brochures. You're a 15-minute drive from the city. It's always 15 minutes. And that quickly is past its best before date. I often think of homes that are marketed in Chilliwack, for example, as being less than an hour from Vancouver. I'm like, that ain't the case anymore, and that's not the pattern that we should be seeking to emulate. I want to describe what this does. Again, we'll get to the really concrete question here of our challenges that we're facing in our communities. But what did this pattern of development look like from the air? So this is Fresno, California. I do Delta, but I don't have a good map like this one. Many of the things do still sort of resemble what we see here, except for the introduction of the agricultural land reserve, which has had a significant impact in our city. That's a whole other talk. But let's take Fresno because I have their map, and it tells an interesting story. This is 1897, and you can see it's a concentrated cluster of activity. The structures there, likely in that time period, given the history on the coast, would have likely been just timber structures used to be able to host the initial occupants of the community. Now, 10 years later, there's been modest outward expansion, but almost certainly as you look at the historical photos of Fresno in that time, it's beginning to thicken up. Their downtown is beginning to take shape. They have core sort of commerce streets, they have retail areas, they have a few bankers and a few bakers and a few others that are moving in. And in this context, yes, there is some modest outward expansion, but much of the activity is deepening the capacity of the existing lands that are being used for housing and for building a community. 1922, you can see, so now we're 20 years later, not that much growth. Even as the West Coast was seeing significant population increases in that time, the growth of the city by horizontal spread is not actually that significant. 1934, even in the midst of a Great Depression, there was still growth activity taking place. And then we get to right after the war, so through those war years, there were new neighborhoods being constructed. But if you were a transit planner, for example, you would say, okay, I can see my routes, I can see my paths, I can see my cores that I'm going to be able to provide that service to. And so if you ever are interested looking up things like streetcar suburbs, these would be instances of those types of streetcar suburbs where as you further expanded transit capacity, you would then make the bet that housing there would be viable because of its connection to other neighborhoods within the city. Now, 1958, we've begun the suburban development pattern or the experiment in doing this in a very different way. I don't even know what's going on over here or over here, but we see all of a sudden in their annexation history, this recognition, well, as we grow, let's you get to be Fresno, you get to be Fresno, you get to be Fresno. And as they continue to build up more and more of these neighborhoods in 1970, then into 1983, then 1995, and then up into 2010, you can see this massive, significant sort of expansion. And yet if you go to Fresno and you want to see multi-story structures, almost the only place you're going to see it is right here. Very little of that extension has been vertical in any significant way, aside from maybe a two-story or now, as it's becoming more commonplace, the 5/1 sort of concrete structures with concrete parking deck that just are plopped into various spots along freeways because they're not allowed in neighborhoods because of the challenges that come when neighbors fight against the introduction of any kind of more modest density within their neighborhoods. In this context, this is in Fresno's numbers. I want to get their numbers, but it tells a tale of the capacity issues that this creates for us. And this is that recognition that one of the interesting things, if I go back to the agriculture trap, is that the agriculture trap, historians have said, actually resulted in some poorer health outcomes. When your diet shifted more to the things that were pulling out of the ground, your diet actually became less vibrant. And you can see some of the shifts in bone density. You can see the shifts in height beginning to shrink as people, yes, they didn't have to fight for their food, but they were also not as fit as they once were. This is something like that. Imagine a city back in 1910, a population of 82,000, and the amount of feet of sewer pipe per person. And again, this is 1910, so this is 8 decades and centuries after the Black Plague. They are providing sewer service. It isn't that it was like, oh, well, they just didn't do it, that's the frontier. No, this is a very healthy city. But by the time you come to 2010, you've increased your population by 1.8. But the amount of obligation you've created for yourself, the distances that you must run, all of those pipes had increased by 27 times. Or take, for example, South Bend. And Peterborough, we've done studies in Peterborough. I just didn't have the slides for you this morning. Similarly, population of 132,000 people in South Bend, Indiana, the home of Pete Buttigieg. If anyone is interested, he's Mayor Pete on the American political side of things. But in order to provide coverage for these areas, 3 lift stations and 0.3 miles of force main. That is areas where you are actively having to push sewer. It's a lot easier to drain sewer than to push sewer. And so that's why you want to be able to do your development in areas where those types of systems and mechanical infrastructure is not required. But in a time when they dropped population by 22%, you see a 1,000% increase in lift stations and a 6,500 increase in the miles of forced main. Again, that is a consequence of, that is this played out in their city as well. Delta has the same challenge. And this is actually one of the challenges that we face in Tawasin and Ladner and in North Delta, is that many of our residents have said, we can't cope with any new development. And to a certain extent, there's an era of truth to that. Because we have so developed that all of our systems are at the point of failure, or many of them are. Many of them are limping along. Our city engineering staff are doing wonders with relining pipes so that way they leak a little less. But we were just talking of one city in the States where 50% of the water that left their pump stations was disappearing before it reached the homes. That's not a good way to run a business. It's not a good way to be a baker in a household and have 50% of your raw ingredients on the floor before you finally put those muffins into people's hands. In that context, this is the result of what many in our neighborhoods have said, well, we have built out this way and we simply can't afford to have any new participants in this process. And the question is, could we ever afford to have built out this way? Could South Bend ever have afforded to actually make themselves financially solvent by doing this? Or is the answer in part to gradually thicken up existing neighborhoods, build where there is existing infrastructure, thicken up and improve that infrastructure over time, but also recognize that much of the drain that is occurring at the outskirts of our community, sort of all of these far-flung areas, which Tsawwassen has them, Ladner has them, North Delta certainly has them as well, areas without a significant amount of population density, resulting in a lowered capacity to extract the amount of money that we need to provide those services through taxes and fees. And in this context, what we get then is a situation where our liabilities have increased significantly, but the people willing to pay for those liabilities have, in some cases, decreased. In Delta, I think our population has certainly increased. We're not in a negative growth situation. One of the challenges that we face in Delta is actually interesting in this way. We've exceeded many of our neighboring municipalities in this because we were very careful to use our cash reserves well for years. This was notable because many other places chose not to. But especially in the United States, Canada is doing this as well. Many communities burned through their cash reserves and then began to use bonds, that is, payments to future generations of bondholders in order to provide for today's services. They began to do this. And now increasingly many communities are actually facing the reality that they're functionally insolvent. Yes, they can go out and borrow, but that borrowing is going to come at even higher costs. We've seen cities go bankrupt because of short-term obligations that they have to pension funds and things like this, but also the long-term obligations that they create for themselves to keep up all of this vital infrastructure are going, which is how you get to situations of 50% of the water disappearing before it ever makes it to the home. And I had a chat with a person that called up. He said, hey, I left a message for us, and he was like, is Strongtown's a cult? And I was like, all right, as a pastor, I want to take this call. Like, is the Strongtowns organization, what we're talking about, is it cultish? And I said, Tim, what are you talking about? He said, I've been a builder in Wisconsin for decades. And he said, I built very modest structures. I was very careful. The projects that I would do for municipalities or for counties tended to be very simple, sort of additions, a small little pump shed here. We would add a wing to the library. He said, my son took over the business, and I am proud of him on one side that he has vastly expanded our construction business. But he said, it seems every single project is now, instead of a wing on the library, it's a brand new library. Instead of an extension of our sewer pipes in order to make them last just a little while longer, it's a whole new system. And he said, instead of using the cash that we have, we're simply saying, just put it on the card. And in this context, he said, we've lost sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity. And in this, he said, Strongtowns was one of the organizations that all of a sudden I heard speaking in the ways that I have long felt. And so he said, am I either losing my mind or are we on the right track? And I said, you are. Like you're grappling with this reality that we face. And this is where our concern is that the suburban experiment has been a failure. And it's something that we need to grapple with. And we'll look at the economic performance in particular in the coming tomorrow. But it is a radical departure from the traditional development pattern. That era of recognizing that places need to gradually emerge and thicken up, using scarce resources really effectively. The suburban experiment was rolling the dice on saying, let's leave our neighborhoods in a state of perpetual adolescence. Let's leave them as they are. And I love these teens. I've got a 10-year-old, and I love him in the state that he's in, but I actually want him to mature, to thicken up, to emerge. And this is the challenge that we face. You could, if I were to remove the filter, this could actually be just another neighborhood in Delta, except now that we filled in the gaps here. This is in Ladner. But many of these homes look virtually the same as they currently do. Entire neighborhoods being built out all at once and to a finished state. Whereas the traditional development pattern consists of assemblies of increasingly independent neighborhoods. There's something interesting that North Delta has a couple of identifiable neighborhoods. You have Annieville, you have the Anniston sort of area, and then you have like the social heart. I don't know what to make of that term, but that's good branding. But then, Tsawwassen doesn't have, aside from Southlands, which was a very deliberate attempt to establish a new sort of neighborhood within a town. Ladner has East Ladner. We have Port Kishon. We have some of these neighborhoods, but many of them go significantly way back in time into the era when these types of neighborhoods were being established with the services and the things that were needed. You would respond to more development occurring by adding new to capacity. You would capitalize on proximity. And this is something where we actually have seen the opposite. Look at East Ladner as an example. East Ladner does have a liquor store, does have a Tim's, and does have a hotel that I haven't stayed at. But in that context, it is interesting that there's so little other development. I mean, there's the co-op, but it's all in one corridor. None of it is intended to be a gathering space. It is intended just a stopping by space that you then carry on with. And this is the difference between what you see in Ladner Village, what we see somewhat here in Tsawwassen, what you definitely are starting to see in the Southlands with that very conscious effort to say, let's build on proximity, the capacity that we have here, and then respond to local pressures. That is, respond iteratively and incrementally to people saying, well, I'd like a place for my hair to get done. I'd like a place for my doctor to have a new office. I'd like a place for a dance studio. We have this challenge that only in specified areas can you currently run a licensed psychiatry practice or whatever other types of services that you need. And in the traditional development pattern, especially here in Ladner, these homes over time became doctors' offices. These homes became accountants and lawyers and all of the good fine folk that we need in our communities, not by going and having to bow and genuflect before a planning commission, but simply by converting a home to do an additional use, to have additional capacity in our communities. We raise a holy terror if such a thing is proposed. I don't want to weigh in too much or be too controversial, but I love the folks at Cookies Ice Cream and them being present in the community, being shooed off their own property because of where they were storing their own vehicle is an example of the challenges that now the folks at Cookies are saying, I'm not sure that I want to set up a storefront if this is the way that I'm treated within my neighborhood. And we have this really fascinating example of a traditional development pattern, sort of in a version of it out at English Bluff, where you see one store that's a little nucleus of activity that could easily be met by additional sort of capacity being added, only it's forbidden. And this is the challenge. I mean, there's always a way. You go and bow and request and do all of these things, but our city planning staff are very attuned to the voices of neighborhoods and say, well, they don't want it, and so we're not going to recommend it. We don't think it should go there, or most typically, it will cause too much traffic. Instead of recognizing it will actually relieve traffic in other parts of our system by allowing more people to meet local needs. And I don't want to romanticize it and be like, oh, you could have a perfect little cluster of village life over there. But kind of really you could. Over time, with willing participants in those areas, only we have made it extremely difficult for this to occur. Notice this is the plat of Ladner Village. And you can see that the focus here of these lots is all right on the streets, because that was the area where wealth building activities were occurring. I'll say, I'll offer critical comment, but also the idea of like the high street concept here in the development proposal mimics this type of location right in the thoroughfares, right in those areas, those zones of opportunity. One of the things I'm excited about in the Ladner Village proposal that Headwaters has brought in is that they are doing some of these smaller units. They have taken over an entire block by the hardware store, but they are at least allowing small-scale commercial to pop up in those areas. Commercial that can be rented by small businesses rather than having to be signed to large leases to Hudson's Bay that won't age well, or to other large tenants, large banks, large pharmacies, when what we need is oftentimes that small, active ecosystem of small opportunities. And this happens through the concentration of activity and prosperity building opportunities. And yet if we went way back to Fresno, to that map I showed you, or just imagine our own map, in our context, one of the challenges that we have is that we have so dispersed our development pattern and forbidden the emergence of these little nodes that we've made it very, very, very difficult for us to be able to cope with the additional sort of assumptions of traffic that are coming into our core sort of areas for services. Tsawwassen the big Tsawwassen Mall now, clogs up the entire highway at times as a consequence of trying to concentrate all of that activity. In contrast with the town center here, where I see far more people walking into this area, far more people having bus service that is more frequent, making its way through this area. As an ally or somebody that's advocating for safer streets, I'm a huge fan of every single retiree that has bought an e-bike, because they are way better at advocating for their needs on the street than I've ever been. Far more persuasive with City Hall and far more capable of taking our city by the reins and saying, we need to actually have the capacity to be able to get around our community on a wheelchair, in a scooter, on an e-bike or a regular bike, and be able to do that as alternatives to always needing to be in a vehicle in order to meet our daily needs. A number of people have shared that they've found apartments and other dwelling units nearby that they actually are able to do much of their needs, meet much of their needs with walking, and there's a genuine benefit with that. Now I noticed I'm already 55 minutes. As a preacher, I usually had 45 to get to my first point. So we'll take a little bit of a break at the top of the hour and then reconvene, particularly on the responses to the housing crisis. But I want to lay out just a couple more things. That one of the challenges that we have in our housing advocacy group here at DelPop, we use this as a slogan for ourselves as well, that our neighborhoods are changing. Many people say, I don't want my neighborhood to change. And I understand that deep down, the challenge that represents, but the truth is, like, our neighborhoods are changing. Tsawwassen used to be a place that people could afford to live on a modest income, on a single modest income. If that is no longer the case, that is a very substantive material change to this entire area. And the result is, the consequence of that is that it has caused Tsawwassen to become ever more exclusive and expensive, more resembling a country club than a vibrant village, where many participants are welcome. Now, it's not gotten it fully to that point, aside from the country club, of course, but it is a space where we see that one of the challenges that we have is we have to address this change in ways that will allow for at least some opportunities for inclusion of more people and diverse housing outcomes within our spaces. And then, remember at the beginning, I shared the story of a friend, a senior in our community, who had to go through this whole loophole process in order to be able to do something that many other seniors are jealous of what she was able to do. This is part of the challenge, that what she did was something that made the neighborhood more inclusive and diverse. She allowed her niece, who was on a modest income with her children, to live in a home that otherwise was off limits to her, even as she got to live in an age-in-place, perfectly designed unit for her that was off limits, except for the fact that they had poured the concrete the wrong way. And so in this context, complex systems have means of correction that bring you up and down through the equilibrium zone with quite a bit of frequency. Our places need to be sort of rapidly responding to needs rather than allowing them to build to the point where then an eruption is the only thing that seems to be possible. I actually liken towers to zits or volcanoes. One, if you're about to eat, let's not dwell too long on the zits, but imagine a pimple on your face is actually the consequence of much of that pressure building up because it's blocked. And as it's blocked, over time, the only thing left for it to do is make an explosion. Well, that's very graphic. Let's talk about volcanoes. Volcanoes, similarly, you see that the building of that pressure and then finally the release of that. There is in our development pattern a recognition that many of the towers that we've introduced in our communities are the consequence and the natural outworking of the vast system of suppression that we built into our systems. Which is where I'm going to be very gentle with those that will say, we can do it a different way. Because there is a different way. But the challenge is we may also have to simultaneously accept many of the volcanoes, many of the eruptions that are occurring, even as we navigate towards the creating of a new political climate in which we allow for the emergence of complete neighborhoods. Because of this, the suburban experiment, and you can see this coded in our bylaws, in our zoning handbooks, all of these things, the suburban experiment is marked by resistance to change. You want change? Not just fill out the form, go through the process, pay all the fees, bow and genuflect before the council, do the things necessary. Resistance to change, exclusion by class, it's written all in the literature. We can see this, we can hear this. Actually, this founding reason why we started DelPop was there was a public hearing on removing some of the restrictions on rentals and where secondary suites could be in Ladner and in Tsawwassen and in North Delta. I spoke up in favor of the changes. They were so modest, just a fraction of what we actually needed to do. On that call, as a renter, I was called a criminal, because that's the only type of person that rents. I was called, we don't need those sorts of people. And it was described as saying, like, I am extractive. I only intend to take from the neighborhood and don't give anything back. Said of the person, we've hosted the first block parties in 40 years on our neighborhood streets. We are the people that are routinely part of our society. We take full ownership. And it was out of this exclusion by class really stood out. And again, I'm not holding everybody to account for some people's ignorant comments. But in this context, that exclusion by class is just assumed. Even when people say, well, this is an upper class neighborhood, We don't use that in the promotional brochure, the realtor might hint at it. This is your type of place. Think of many ways in which we mark this exclusion by class, not so much by race, but especially by class. Previously, race and class were much more closely connected. And then that last one, the assumption of mandatory car ownership. As we talk about the changes, that assumption of mandatory car ownership is one, not true of everyone. Almost 50% of the population is driven by others. That's seniors, that's children, that's the second occupant of a vehicle. Many people are driven by others and are not the primary owners of their vehicle. People that use transit, people that cycle. And in that setting, the assumption that, everybody drives here and every single house here is a car waiting at the traffic light there is incorrect. And yet it's coded within our systems. And so out of this, we have, in this context, traded a robust incremental approach for a complicated and fragile pattern of suburban style development. With that, this fragile pattern of suburban style development expects water, sewage, garbage, fire, police, schools, busing, easy, rapid access to amenities. Not just easy access, as in you can easily get there on the bus. No, it has to be rapid, at my time, at my convenience, in my car. And then, always interestingly, we also see the rise, especially in other cities, but you see it here too. We substitute our own versions of the things we previously would have enjoyed in public. Pools? Oh, let's do that in our own backyard. Coffee. Let's get that coffee in the fanciest, swankiest coffee bar in our home because it's too much of a hassle to walk to the neighborhood cafe. Gyms, all sorts of different things like this. And in consequence, the political demands of this class is for low taxes per acre, but which is they can have large lots, but pay low taxes on that on a per lot basis, and yet equal services, the demand of equal services, the concern, we don't want, don't shortchange us, even if the revenue coming into the city is less than other areas are contributing to the communities. And so we're at the hour mark. We are set to go for 2 hours, and I did say we have 6 questions that are queued up, but why don't we take a break, take a little shuffle around, engage in vigorous debate or reactions, head out, grab a coffee if you want to. We'll start in 5 minutes and carry on from there.
Thank you.
Just like inflation is doing with our money. So we've had an inflated 5-minute break turned into a 10-minute break, but I'm sure it was well spent. So let's return. This is a description of what the path of stability and changing up our development pattern has resulted in. These are the Canadian house prices are here in the red. And so as you can see, they are coming, we're not the top red line here. So we were, these are generally modest sort of changes in house values over time. And then all of a sudden we had this runaway escalation. 2014, we had a bit of a reset, but these are home prices for Canada completely outpacing all of our other peers, creating the deep tensions that we face in our system. And this is where our deep concern is that our complex systems have a means of correction, but complicated systems fail, they break. And this will be the challenge that we have is if we are routinely passing through what we call the equilibrium zone that is allowing for house prices to sometimes go down, allowing for rents to sometimes fall. As a renter, I'm hoping for a house crash, so that way the prices will come down extremely low. But I love people who would be devastated by that, whose life savings would be evaporated, whose prospects would be materially changed, whose systems are so predicated on this only going up because that is the assumption of how you lock in wealth, how you build wealth, to the point where in these years, people who worked were foolish for doing so because their house was earning more than they were. That is not a good system and good setup to be in. And yet the other challenge that we had, Stephen Quinn did a great program on the radio called about housing. Anyways, the CBC broadcaster, and he asked a social scientist at UBC who had published saying that house prices should never really rise more than, I think it was 3 times a person's annual income. And he said, if you believe that, will you sell me your house for that much? And she said, no, because she also is caught up in that system. And this is what that switched, where now we really struggle because our systems are not built for either a correction back to a process that works for most of us, or into a situation where now so many other patterns are built on us getting to this point. So when we think of housing as shelter, when housing is understood as shelter, all housing types are needed and are welcomed in rapid, or I would say fluid response, sort of dynamic response to local need. So remember that little add-on that you added for Uncle Joe? That is a rapid or a fluid response to local need. It's setting out, for example, mint tiny homes. Take a look at these beautiful tiny homes built here in Delta, illegal to put on your property. Perfectly suited for young couples, seniors, all sorts of people. They are award-winning everywhere that they are put, except in Delta where they're built. That is a consequence of saying even something like a tiny house, which can be fetishized, but it's just a version of a small house that is attainable because its floor plate is small, which means that per square footage cost might be a little bit higher, but its actual purchase cost is low. That is off the table in our city. Now, that means we've got a bunch of extra buyers that otherwise would have maybe made this work in their lifestyle, saying, well, that's not available, so I need to bid up the condo, or I need to take on some other thing. And in this context, change increases opportunities. Well, when housing is recognized as an investment or sort of dependent upon for people's pension funds and 401 TFSAs and all of this, you want, and your banker wants, predictable financial units that are predicated on or built on a sense of persistent scarcity, because that's what maximizes value. This is where we do see efforts by large home developers that are doing, especially in the United States, where they're building thousands of units all at once in sprawling brand new neighborhoods, actively working against legislation to reform parking requirements, to reform zoning requirements, because they say the system works for us. This is also one of the challenges where many of the current projects underway in the Lower Mainland, on the basis of persistent scarcity, have actually said we're pausing the project, which is why I have a lot of respect for the companies that are still going forward with projects right now, because they said the interest rate dropped by 0.5%. And the financials don't work for us to maximize our return on these units, and therefore we're going to pause it, we're going to hold. And in this context, as an investment, you can hold a project. If you have billions of dollars behind you, or even multi-millions behind you, you can pause and sort of sit on that land, let your contractors wait for a little bit longer. But if you're building just for yourself or for your neighbor, you wouldn't do that. You'd be like, I've got to just get this to completion so I can start the next one. And in this context, change threatens the bottom line. How many times will we hear in these debates in Tsawwassen and Ladner, this is going to crater my house price value? Change threatens the bottom line. That's the concern. Even though academic studies are demonstrating, no, that's actually not the case. You will continue to see an appreciation in your property price, and yet many people are very suspicious of any kind of new housing, housing as shelter in particular, because it threatens the bottom line. And so this is the challenge that we found ourselves in. I like this graphic that my brother-in-law put together on his blog. Housing is expensive, and it's time to celebrate, because look who benefits from high house prices. Your local government, your state, I have a Canadian version of this slide, shoot. BC government, the federal government, homeowners, banks, insurance companies, developers, contractors, land speculators, realtors, pension funds. Who's on the other side? A few of us. But we're finding pitchforks. And this is the challenge of social disruption emerging out of these things. Housing, for the first time in the last federal election, was a campaign issue that all the major parties all seem to agree on, and it's only gotten worse. Well, that graph doesn't show it this year, but it's only gotten worse.
I'm
Yes?
going to add to your list people that like community under the who doesn't.
People who like community?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, a lot of people like their community with the really high house prices, but I hear you. Yeah, actually, yes, I will have to go and add that. Here's part of the challenge that I have asked in larger rooms where I'll say, how many of you have lived in a space that is, pardon, back up. How many of you would like to live in a place that's 500 square feet or less? And most people are like, no, except for the one poor renter who's like, well, I'll take it if I can own it. And then I'll say, how many of you have lived in a space that is 500 square feet or less, or even 800 square feet? And most in the room will put up their hands because they recognize for a while, I was in a space that I could afford, that I needed for my needs. And in this context, this is the United States up until 2022. Those homes under 200,000 across the US are now gone. Everything under 300 is almost deceased. And in the Lower Mainland, it's been dead as a doornail for a decade or so. In this context, this is the challenge. If there is no bottom rung on the ladder anymore, there is no way for many people to enter up or end up on that ladder. Now, here's, I think, a great analogy. The development industry is not choosing to build only for the rich because that's better. They are behaving exactly the way we would expect any industry to respond to an artificial cap on their production volume. Toyota would do the same thing. If you said you can only build 100,000 cars, we'll come to the description of how many units per acre can we allow in this community. If you say only a limited amount, you're going to get a very specific type. They would scrap the Camry, they would only build the Lexus, even though at volume they're able to build the Camry more profitably. And in the context of driving, you probably recognize when we get into a fishtail, you try to hold on, and at some point you just lose it. That is what it feels like we're in. So what do? As a broad overarching concept, something sort of as an earworm to put in your mind, is we need to remove our suburban aversions to complex adaptation, to recognize and account for all of the ways in which we strategically exclude by class or status, find a lot of these things even still built into our zoning bylaws and codes, standards that we have that actually are arbitrary and don't need to be there, a resistance to change, and crucially, that assumption of auto-dependency. If one drives, one will always drive. If new people arrive, they will always drive, is one of those core concepts. If someone is ever at all to spend $1 in our community, they're going to arrive by car if they're worth having. That is something that we can challenge, and that is something that we, in the book, talk about at length. But I'm going to go through 6 items that we've identified in what we call the Housing Ready Toolkit for local code reform. Delta is making some progress on some of these in fractional ways, but we'll touch on this in a moment. If you go to strongtowns.org/housingready, that's where we actually have put more of these materials. What do you think that this one is talking about? Bit of a challenge for you.
Tearing it down and building another.
No, not quite. It's allowing single-family home conversion to duplex or to triplex by right. Adding in those additional spaces, redeploying. In the United States, I don't have the Canadian numbers, but the average house, or the average number of occupants per house is now below 2. That means there are lots of extra bedrooms. I actually heard one person say Vancouver does not have a housing shortage. It does not have a bedroom shortage, it has a home shortage. We have additional capacity. What if that capacity becomes available by right? That is with the least amount of regulatory friction. And even as the provincial government has said up to 4 units on every local residential lot, I can assure you that it is still not easy to see that through, to actually go through the process to do that work of conversion. What if we said, meet the building code? That's it. We'll give you the building permit because you came in, you said, here's what I plan to do. Now, so long as you meet the building code, so it's not some death trap, let's get ourselves to the situation where that is just happening rapidly. Think, for example, as well, in Delta, I think this is still the case where we have standards that only one main entrance can be used to access one part of the home. Well, that's silly. That is just straight up strategic exclusion by class because that's what the poor people do. And it's one of those things that even heritage homes in Vancouver, you walk in the front door, and the only thing that lets you know that this is actually a triplex is there's 3 mailboxes. Otherwise, it virtually resembles everything else on the street, which is what many people want. They are like, I want to recognize my neighborhood. So if the building type never has to change, but the number of occupants can, that is actually a great value to us. These are very normal types of uses across our communities. And the challenge that we have is that we've suppressed this in so many different ways. What about this one?
When you say we,
Yeah.
who are you talking about?
Us as a broad municipal culture of what we have enshrined in our OCP, what we've enshrined in our development bylaws, the things that we elect people to then leave in place rather than to change.
Well, and with that, a lot of people are uninformed. So they vote for certain issues, but they're not really informed about how their community is designed.
Yeah, to a certain extent, although there's also the recognition that many people are voting by their values. Many people have particular values, and when they feel that those values are threatened, they will respond by saying, well, this candidate speaks in a way that more clearly expresses the things that I'm interested in. So I hear you, I agree, but I also am careful not to say like bad people, good people, and I know that you're not saying that, but sometimes that can be like dumb people, smart people, and we always say the most pertinent observer of a community is the person that just lives there, takes note of what's going on, and says, huh, that's interesting, why is that like that? Why do we only ever see one front door in the front of a house and duplexes are so rare? Why is it so difficult to put a backyard cottage into our residential zones? Yeah.
Well, I get back to education because most people don't even question that. It's become so much a part of our consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And an interesting thing.
So when it becomes that, you don't fight against it because it's just that.
Yeah. And I mean, as an organization and as part of my work is trying to help people to be great concerned citizens, taking up the question of why is my city this way? And an interesting example is right across the street from us, the sons of the homeowners had bought large pickup trucks, taking up most of the street. It felt like we didn't have a say in it. It just happened, and we kind of got used to it. Backyard cottages, on the other hand, would set off a firestorm. Up until recently, you can have a house for your pool, you can have a house for your lawnmower, but you cannot have a house for your grandmother. And so permitting backyard cottages in all residential zones, again, meet the building code, but move on it. We still have such restrictive things that if this is just a little bit too close to that fence line, yeah, you can't do it. You can't fit it. We have limits on what size it can be. I remember the debate over sheds in people's backyards that was a couple of years ago, and one of the council members said, yeah, well, what if they live in it? I was like, I mean, they're all right, they're probably using the toilet in the main house, they're probably doing those types of things, but it was seen as such a scare, a weariness of what if people lived in those spaces. Here, for example, we have residentials 1, 2, 3, 4, 4A, 5, 6, 7. What if we did a coach house? And I said to the planning director, I said, we could just take all of the material from here and just copy it in here and be like, oh, by the way, if you want also, like add those things in at no extra cost. It would have been a simple motion at the council table to be able to amend our zoning bylaw, and we did none of that until a provincial order required it. And even now, this is from today that I picked this out, it's still there.
Why was it not done before it became a provincial order?
It was not deemed to be a priority. So the assumption was the housing needs of our communities are strained, are stressed, but like we have to go through this whole process. And so one of the challenges is making those small changes. So the city of Kalamazoo, the city of Bellingham, Washington, just for two American examples, they said, we expect our council staff on an almost every other week basis to bring proposals for change. Small, modest tweaks. One of my staff members that I work with, he actually would, when he was a deputy city manager, would begin each meeting with like 10 minutes of reading through their code book. And they would read through the code book and say, why is that there? And if it didn't belong there, or in this situation, if you could simply say, hey, we already have all that good language, let's just add it to these other things and see what happens. Instead it was, no, because only after we do the full review in the city of Delta, which is not alone, so I'm not throwing shade, it's we need a consultant. So first we need to put the bid on BC Bid. Then we need to go through this whole process of lining up the right consultant to do it, even though I know how to do Control V. Control C, Control V, and then bring it to council. And so there is this sense, what about the unintended consequences of coach houses in the backyard? Now, I'm leaning a little bit into what I feel is an absurdity, but it is this challenge that we have faced across our communities. What is this one representing? And I did refer to these a little bit earlier. Starter homes. Starter homes are simply things that are smaller than many other people are building. Maybe even a mid-tiny house. And I'm not sponsored by them. They don't even know I exist, but I just find it fascinating that we don't allow these types of homes. And this can be something where someone carves out a lot, subdivides that lot, goes through a very simple process, and is allowed to build on the excess capacity. Maybe we have large lots, so we actually get the two neighbors to each sell a third of their lot, and we place them in that position. Or we do interesting things where we say, hey, on the back of the lot, we can actually carve out a space. They're called flag lots, when they actually have a tiny little strand of land that is technically owned by that homeowner that comes up to the street, so that way they can get residential mail service and they can get a proper mortgage through that. And then they count as an additional new occupant on the street. Instead, we said, no, that's too complex. That's too messy. We prefer complicated, regulated, and predictable. And the result of this is the crippling challenge that we find ourselves in. And again, all of these codes for a season worked, gave us what we have. But we're also seeing what's not working. And we really need to take those steps to incrementally adjust what we're working with. These are tiny little shotgun houses this is in Pensacola, Florida. Just putting them in there. The consequence of this is that the purchase price is significantly lower for these, simply because you are buying fewer feet of square footage. So you can, and this is the whole attraction of the tiny house movement, is you can build wonderful little homes with really deluxe finishings if you can just bring your unit size down. We also see this with apartments that are being constructed. One of the great tragedies in my mind, maybe I'm off script a little bit here, but in Lander Village, we had a really interesting proposal by Headwater Project. The first drawings that went up were 6 stories, were properly 6 stories, and had a really interesting sort of heritage fishing village design that I thought was quite not only attractive, but worked in the space and provided for those top units to be the premium units that would attract premium buyers, which means, as a result, on the whole project envelope, you can sell some of the lower ones at a slightly reduced rate. What did the city say? Can you hide those top stories? Can you hide them? Meant, can you basically layer cake them away from the street, so that way we hide that it's a 6-story building? Whose benefit was that serving? In fact, there's a lot of research that says it's only the first couple of floors that you really experience as a pedestrian, even from some distance, where really a lot of that work has to be on what does that street front exposure feel like. And beyond that, walk through Vancouver, you almost don't even know what happens on the 10th through the 20th stories.
But you feel it, especially with towers.
It is, I often feel like it is intensely felt and then over time gradually accepted. But I know that is a controversial take.
Yeah,
And
there's lots of research on the psychology and how it impacts human beings and children.
But we love forests, we love mountain ranges, we love other landscapes. 8-story, we had a grain mill right in Lander Village that was 8 stories. Like we are used to tall structures, but a key part of it was by removing those premium units at the top where there's value, and by trying to hide that, it actually caused the design to radically shift. There's an interesting, this is a whole other topic, but there was an interesting move from thin vertical to flat horizontal, and it's really made that structure in Lander, though I accept that we need it, a lesser product than it would otherwise have been. And Headwaters, the project proponent, said we had to do it, otherwise we wouldn't have been able to move it through. We've gotten flat landscape stuff, and we prefer, go through a forest and the visual aspect of that.
It's a completely different aesthetic.
All right, we'll come to that. Yeah, but we can lower the bar entry. These are simple, small structures in Lander. These were the building blocks of prosperity. This is the founding sort of potential for something like a cottage court cluster. But if you gave the proposal, can we add a unit up front, a little unit at the back, we'll reorient this one, and they've done that next door to it, but it's the exception, not the norm. And this is the challenge that we are in. What about this one? What do you think this is representing? eliminating minimum lot size requirements in existing neighborhoods. We have entire subdivisions that can no longer be subdivided. I mean, that's curious. If the subdivision process was the way of unlocking and capturing the wealth of what was a large grain field and turning it into units that could be then exchanged and transferred and used for good, what if we kept that process going? And yet, in our context, this is from our zoning bylaws, no lot created by subdivision of land shall be smaller in area than the minimum lot size set out in this section of this bylaw. Even then, even if you were to try to propose a change, it cannot be any smaller than 10% of the lots in the subdivision. Who does that help? Who does that benefit? Is that not a part of that resistance to change and exclusion by class? And actually, I would add assumption of auto dependency, because frequently it's like, where are they going to park if they don't have enough street frontage in order for them to be able to have a driveway that they can put the car in the garage that they never use and only put their stuff in? But that's another thing. In this context, what you see is like these little shotgun homes. Yeah, here. These are on tiny little lot sizes. These are the types of things that we so need in our communities.
Here were the things that were originally in this community.
Go to Beach Grove. Yep, 100%, where you see a lot of variety, a lot of that. And from the city planner's perspective, it's messy. They're like, well, I've never had to divide by 12 before. Or, these are so low, like, how do we get things to fit? But the reality is we can adjust setbacks. We can adjust many of these types of requirements. This is a very interesting development. This is in Lafayette, Louisiana. I have asked Allie, can you please move to Delta? Because I want to see a lot of this type of development here.